after lunch as opposed to sneaking out on a nice sunny day. I'm a professor at the University of Utah. I study attention, and I study it from a number of different perspectives, including cognitive neuroscientist. So I study the brain and how the brain works as we multitask. I also study that in kind of real-world settings where people are trying to multitask in the operating room, flying an airplane, or where they're driving a car. So what I want to talk to you about today is the idea of multitasking. Hopefully by the end of the day I will convince you that multitasking isn't as great as it sounds like you might think it is. That in fact your brains are set up, even though the brain itself is a massively parallel system with all kinds of neurons that are connecting all the time, our behavior is serial. And so you really, when you think you're multitasking, are really doing one activity at a time. That has three consequences that make multitasking not very effective. The first is that when you multitask, you're actually trying to do two things at the same time, switching from one activity to the other and back. As you're switching attention back and forth, that switch time turns out to be a large percentage of the overall amount of time you try multitasking. You're going to see statistics and some examples that show that maybe up to a third of the time you spend during the day trying to multitask is just managing that switch time back and forth. So one activity, one problem associated with multitasking is that it wastes time. The second thing is that it opens the door for all kinds of errors. Because if I'm switching from one task to another and back and forth, I can easily lose track of where I was in either one of those activities and start to make mistakes. And we'll see that there are a number of accidents and in many cases fatalities that are directly attributed to the fact that people are losing track in terms of where they are in the sequence. Maybe in the everyday workplace it might not lead to a catastrophic failure or fatality, but you may nonetheless actually have a product that's not quite as good as you'd like. And the third part about multitasking is I'm going to show you evidence that parts of the brain that are responsible for constantly switching attention back and forth are associated with the same kind, or basically the same brain regions that are responsible for higher order thinking, for creative thought and so forth. So as you start to multitask a lot, you'll find that there's a range in terms of how creative and you are thinking, and it also increases the overall level of stress. So I have to first of all provide evidence, I think, to support all those claims to you that multitasking each time makes you more likely to errors and is a stressor. And then after I show you evidence of that, I'm going to show you some ways to try and manage time to actually kind of control those multitasking episodes so you can work more efficiently while still trying to juggle all the kind of things you need to do in the workplace. So let's take a look at some of the common kind of myths of multitasking. The first is that multitasking is a new phenomenon. That it's just something that's relatively happened in the last generation, and it really we didn't have those kinds of issues, decades ago. And that turns out not to be the case. Every generation for the last, at least this last several generations, has been saying that they're the new multitasking generation. And I guarantee right now that the kids who are, working on their, sending text messages behind their back and video gaming and everything like this, these guys think they're the latest generation of multitasking, but they're just another line in a long series of things. Multitasking has been around for a long time. You can trace it back to the implementation of kind of the electronic age, where we all of a sudden have started computers and cell phone. But even in that case, there, over the last 70 or 80 years, it's been around for quite some time. So it's not new. The other thing is, you may think that, hey, I can just learn how to multitask anything. Well, there's a large literature on training that suggests that that's just not the case. It turns out that any two attentional demanding tasks that require your concentration are going to compete for attention, and no matter how much practice you give, there's studies that have given pilots hundreds of thousands of trials of practice. If there are two tasks that kind of are demanding attention at the same time, you have to flip with one. Now, there are some things like walking and chewing gum. Maybe you can do those two at the same time, but we can show you some examples where that sometimes is trouble. So anyhow, the first thing is it's not the case that you can just practice and practice and practice and become really, really good at multitasking certain kinds of things. The kinds of things that you are typically trying to do are creatively solving some problem here and something else over there. And those things require attention and require deliberate thought. You can't multitask those things effectively. Third, multitasking makes you more efficient. That's probably the reason people try and do it most often, is I can actually handle a bunch of different things at the same time. It turns out that's actually a real big illusion. If you look, there's time costs, there's errors, and higher levels of stress. Corporations that have actually gone in and done things like, say, we're going to basically put a prohibition on using cell phones while driving. A classic example of multitasking and driving and, say, talking or texting. What those corporations have found is an increase in productivity and a 30% decline in reported crashes. So it's not the case that multitasking makes you more efficient. You may think that's the case, but it's a bit of an illusion, partly because your own ability to assess how efficient you are is the same brain resources that are responsible for juggling all these tasks. And the last thing is multitasking can hurt performance. What's the harm in trying to juggle two things? And the harm is it slows you down, makes all kinds of errors and so forth. And so the combination of these things is that multitasking turns out to be an activity that many people do in their daily activities, but nonetheless actually kind of doesn't actually lead to better performance. It leads to kind of compromised performance. So what are the culprits in terms of daily multitasking? For the most part, these are the two culprits that are really kind of taking most of the time. This dreaded smartphone, this thing right here, that it's a wonder in a sense, right? It's actually as powerful as many of the computers around university campuses 20 or 30 years ago. So that's actually really cool. But if you just let it run your life, like calling your attention no matter what, when it rings, when you text, when an email comes in, you become a slave to this technology. And so one of the things we do is try and figure out how to use this in a way where you're in control of it rather than it being in control of you. Same kind of thing with email. You see that a lot of times people, I get a couple hundred emails a day. Imagine most everybody here gets 50 to 100 emails a day. Most of them are garbage, right? Or most of them are things where you don't need to act on them immediately. But if you stop whatever you're doing and go and see what that email is, then basically it turns out that just interrupts the day, interrupts that piece of work, interrupts the quality. So these two devices, email and the smartphone that allows you to text, talk, and so forth, they're great devices, but the way their default mode is set up, they're designed to interrupt you at any moment's time. And that's actually suboptimal in terms of kind of interacting with each other. So here's kind of the modern world, right? This is we were at a restaurant about a month or so ago, and here you have the modern family. The dad on his smartphone, the daughter is plugged into her laptop, mom is on her smartphone, and the kid's plugged into his electronic device. They don't interact with other people. What we're finding, Cliff Nassif from Stanford has done a lot of work looking at what happens with a lot of technologies. It's becoming a layer between interactions between people, and something's lost in that translation. You get all kinds of confusions, misinterpretations. Anyhow, you don't interact with other people. You even see people sometimes when they're at the same table sending texts to one another, even though they're actually sitting. We're getting wired to do it. We're starting at an earlier age. You can find devices like this where the baby interacts with an iPad and doesn't interact with other people. There are some kind of horrifying videos of little kids a little bit older than this who don't understand what a magazine or a book is. So they keep pushing the little pictures on the book to try and get them to pop up like they normally would on iPads. So there's a concern that this may be addicting technology, something that lulls you into things. So I've got a little series of tests to see if you might be suffering from technology addiction. Do you check your smartphone compulsively? Check your phone compulsively. How many times a day do you look at your phone? More than 50? The average in the U.S. is 130. Look at yourself 130 times a day. That's the average. That's actually a lot of activity looking at that. Do you experience phantom vibrations? Great. We've actually done studies where people have been out in nature for 3 or 4 days and they still feel that kind of vibration. If you experience that, that may be a problem. Do you sleep with your phone? Yeah? 60% of the U.S. people in the U.S. sleep with their phone. Some of them under their pillow. Nearby, some of them under their pillow. You suffer from Facebook depression. Maybe you guys don't, I don't know. But some people do, where basically if they make a post on Facebook and they don't get a lot of likes saying it's a cool comment, they actually start to get depressed if their friends don't think that they're actually cool. It's a new kind of disorder that's associated with social media. Do you check your email as soon as it arrives? Because if my email's up and I don't be able to configure it so that I can turn it off, then it's a real tempting thing to look at. Right? Do you check your email last thing before you go to bed and first thing when you wake up in the morning? No? Okay. There's something called the Google effect of memory. And this basically says you start to actually rely on Google to search for things and you stop remembering them. Anthony Wagner of Stanford has been studying this and showing that actually people are not developing the memory skills that they normally used to use because they're just relying on the internet. Which is fine unless the internet goes down and then you're kind of out of luck. Do you text while driving? No? Good. I hope not. We know that texting while driving is really a significant source of distraction. In fact, you're 8 times more likely to be involved in a crash if you're texting compared to if you're not engaged in this activity. That 8 times is twice the limit, twice the crash risk of someone who's drunk. Do you spend more time playing videos and being outdoors? A lot of kids do. If you look at college students now, they'll spend 8 hours a day behind the screen playing video games. They'll spend more time interacting with media and video games at the end of high school than they spent in class studying for high school. And last, do you interrupt intimate relations to send emails? 17% of the people in the UK reported yes. That suggests that that's an activity that is pretty addictive, pretty compulsive. So, what do we know about this? About multitasking? Well, we know that the brain is a serial processor. So, once you switch to one activity, it takes time to switch back. So, the average worker, knowledge worker, switches tasks every 3 minutes. And once distracted, it takes nearly half an hour to resume the task. So there's a switch, and after the switch, they don't come back. You can think about this as, hey, there's this email says I should call this person, I should check online, and by the time you get back to the task, it's a half hour later. You've lost a half an hour. The interruptions associated with multitasking and media now constitute basically the requisite recovery time. Constitutes about 28% of your day. So if you think about kind of this switching back and forth, and if you don't schedule your time properly, up to a quarter of the time during the day is basically just lost in that translation, lost in that kind of switch. Under deadline pressure, workers produce creative work. Workers produce creative work on days when they're focused, but not when they're scattered. This is that idea of creativity. If you're constantly switching back and forth, you don't have the time to concentrate, come up with some kind of creative, insightful problems. Your work starts to become scattered and interrupted, and not quality. Employees who are routinely interrupted lack time to focus and are more apt to feel frustrated, pressured, and stressed. This is the stress part of constantly multitasking, trying to juggle multiple things. Not only is there time pressure, and not only do you make more errors, but it tends to increase the overall level of stress in your daily life. And what we find actually is if you wrestle the phone away from people for a couple of days, and you say you can't use that phone, and you disconnect it, unplug them from the digital technology, you look and you find, first of all, there's reported levels of stress, and the measurable level of stress goes down, and the levels of creative problem solving go up by as much as 50%. So it's a big time drain. Multitaskers experience a 40% drop in productivity across the board, and it takes 50% longer to accomplish than a single task, and then you make 50% more errors if you're multitasking than if you're focusing on one task at a time. Here's your increased time and increased errors. So even though you may do it, I do it, we all do it, it's useful to realize that when you're doing this, you're not necessarily being efficient and effective and productive. When you look at the measured IQ, there's ways in which you can actually measure performance IQ. When people are multitasking, trying to juggle multiple things, about 10 points of IQ are kind of used up just juggling that activity. You just aren't as smart when you're multitasking. If you're trying to talk on the cell phone or on a phone while you're trying to type some message, that conversation is just not going to be the quality conversation. And the message you're trying is not going to be a real good message either, because you're basically diverting attention between the two tasks. And in terms of workplace accidents, OSHA suggests that distraction associated with multitasking is the leading cause of accidents in the workplace, and associated with 44,000 accidents since 1976. So it has a big effect. We're not effective at it. Nonetheless, we still do it. So there's actually a National Academy of Science panelist meeting right now, or in the process of meeting, that's kind of looking at how multitasking is affecting how we behave. And here's a couple of the blogs from the Psychology Today that kind of looked at multitasking. And I know this is small print, so I'll read it. Minding your inner moron while multitasking is such a waste. Finding your inner moron, why multitasking is such a waste. 5 reasons why we multitask anything. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our gadgets, but in ourselves. Competing in the Daily Show keeps students' attention, so you have this competition for watching the streaming media. Flooding your brain's engine, how you can have too much of a good thing. And mindless interruptus, distractions are costlier than you think. These are all just blogs that are especially focusing on the fact that we don't multitask as well as we think we do. And is background music a boost or a bummer? It depends on what music it is, but if it's music with lyrics, it turns to actually oftentimes to be a distraction. So there's a number of blogs that are associated with looking at multitasking in everyday settings. I want to give you an example to start with of multitasking and the definition of it. So this is an example that actually the guys at Car Talk sent me. And so provides kind of a real world example.
All right, so we're driving on the freeway, and I look over, and this guy is reading a book.
Oh my God.
Wait. It's a fucking iPad? It's a Kindle. Yo, dog, I think you're like, he's on his cell phone and the Kindle. Now he's holding the book.
Kind of an extreme example. Not that crazy. I imagine in your daily commute you probably see something as close to that as well, right? So, here's this guy who, I don't know how he's steering, right? Maybe with his knee. But you can think about that's a classic example maybe of over multitasking. And kind of a formal definition, you might think about multitasking as performing 2 activities at the same time, 2 concurrent tasks that are separate or functionally independent and involve different goals and have different stimuli. And you can think about this as being Okay, here's the task of driving in the last example. That's his one task. And this other guy's task was to read a book and to read Kindle and to talk on the cell phone. Two tasks that have you're trying to do at the same time, and trying to do two at the same time. And it turns out actually that guess what? Driving is kind of compromised when you're trying to read a book or trying to talk on the cell phone, or trying to read a Kindle. And not only that, you're probably not remembering much about what book you're reading either. Right? You can kind of trade it. So let's look at some numbers. Multitasking by the numbers. 11. The average number of minutes an employee can devote to a project before being interrupted. It's pretty kind of complex. And if you think 5 or 6 times during an hour of work, you're actually interrupted by email, or text messages, or people knocking on your door, or something along those lines. 28% of the workday is lost in interruptions associated with inefficient multitasking, and in particular, it's one of the biggest culprits. 2.1 hours per day is the average that's lost per person in terms of productivity over a 40-hour work because of these kinds of switch-offs. And at the national level, $650 billion is lost due to inefficiencies associated with unnecessary interruptions. There we go. So, like I said, I'm a neuroscientist, and so first of all, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how the brain's working to give you an idea about why multitasking is troublesome. So, this is the brain, basically, with electrical activities are generated by a colleague of mine at UC San Francisco, Adam Gonzalez, actually showing the patterns of activation. You can see the entire brain is active, as this is actually even at rest. The areas of the brain that are going to be most associated with multitasking are the prefrontal cortex, the frontal portions of the brain. They're responsible for kind of switching from one activity to another, remembering where you were, getting you back on task. Those frontal brain regions are also, though, important in higher order thinking. They're the same brain regions that are thinking, helping to think creatively, to solve problems, to be able to think kind of outside the box in kind of important ways. One of the things you should notice in this video, this is the brain kind of in kind of a resting state. Not sleeping, but you're awake, but you're not doing some heavy multitasking. You should have noticed that the whole brain's active. So that myth that you might have learned in grade school that we only use 10% of the brain is just completely wrong. Neuroscientists say that's just completely wrong. It's not true. You're using all of your brain all of the time. And in fact, actually even small little parts of the brain may be damaged due to some kind of stroke, can lead to fairly substantial impairments in terms of the ability to be able to function in our daily environment. First of all, think that the entire brain is important in everyday functioning, and the frontal brain regions are the areas of the brain that are most associated with multitasking. One way you can tell that is this is the MRI facilities at the University of Utah, and you can have the person lay on the back of this, and then you can actually look at the brain activity. There's something called functional magnetic resonance imaging that allows you to be able to scan the brain and see what parts are active. When we push, this is now the kind of the patterns of the brain that are active when somebody is really being pushed for high levels of multitasking. These are the frontal brain regions. It's as if someone's laying on the back looking straight towards you. So here's the left, the right, and the left frontal polar region. It's the very frontal portions of the brain. The dorsolateral and the anterior cingulate. These are all kind of a network in the frontal portion of the brain that's responsible for switching from one task to another, maintaining set goals, and going back and forth. If you do excessive multitasking in the workplace, those are the brain regions that are going to be really kind of heavily active. Think trying to solve calculus problems for an hour and a half, and then afterwards you're kind of brain dead. That brain dead is basically depleted the resources in that frontal brain region. And that frontal brain region is attention, and attention is necessary for successful performance. And so you can think about, as I'm paying attention, you can think about it as a resource that can be allocated to perceiving the world, making good decisions, activating long-term memory and working memory, and then making good responses. You try and multitask by layering something else on that. It depletes attention from these activities, and you perceive the world less well, you make poorer decisions, and you make poorer responses. So I want to actually start now by just giving you a number of statistics, but to kind of just empirically show that multitasking really isn't as good as you might think. I need someone to kind of be a volunteer guinea pig. Someone want to try it out? It's relatively painless. Anyone want to try? Someone. I can't go on without somebody. There we go. Thank you. All right. This is a real simple task. 3 parts to it. First part is I'm going to time you to see how quickly you can just say the letters A through R. Yeah, so A, B, C, D, I. Ready? When I say go, start. Go.
C, D, E, F, G, H, I.
Okay, took about 2 seconds. Very good. Now I want you to basically just letters. Or actually, now numbers. 1 through 9. Again, when I say go, start. Go.
79.
2 seconds. Very good. So those are both kind of single tasks, just doing the letters, just doing numbers. Now I just want you to kind of simply just multitask between the two. So what I want you to do is go A1, B2, C3, and we'll just see how you do there. When I say go ahead and start. Go.
A1, B2, C3, D4, E5, F6, G7, H8, I9.
Good.
Okay.
Very good. I appreciate it because I couldn't have gone with that. Do you notice that one was a lot easier than the other? Right, it was really easy to do the top one, really easy to do the bottom one, and that took not just twice as much. Right? If there was no switch costs, it would have been basically 2 plus 2 is 4, but it turned out actually to be 14 seconds. So there's something going on there that's actually causing you to have to stop, think about something else, load it into memory, perform it, stop, and switch back and kind of remember where you were. That whole multitasking sequence is what trips you up. And you can think about it as kind of like, here's our counting task, and here's our letter task. And when I perform them, I'm basically going A1, B2, C3, D, where I'm switching back and forth. But there's a task switching cost that's associated with switching from one, stopping one, inhibiting it, activating the other, thinking about it a little bit. So even with something as simple as that little task there, it turns out that what is it, almost 3 times as much to perform 2 tasks in comparison as opposed to just doing one by itself. So what do we know? We know really the brain's actually, even though it's a massive serial processor, they really are sequential behavior, and you have to suppress one activity and start another. And constantly you're incurring these switch costs, and these switching costs can actually mount up to be substantially more than the actual amount of time you're actually doing this. If you're switching a lot, it's actually completely counterproductive. And in the real world, you're probably not switching that fast. But these switch costs, depending on how complex you're doing things, you can actually really have to count that time can actually really mount up. There are a handful of people, however, a small percentage, who seem to be able to excel at multitasking. We call them supertaskers. They're about 1 to 2% of the population. They're probably the elite fighter pilots and really super high-end performers. And we've tested people out in a number of settings to try and look at the brains and how their brains differ. This is actually a task that we developed when I was down in Australia. And so, being in Australia, they go clubbing a lot, and they want to only let cool people into the club. And so, only cool people would never go in the same door that someone's used before. That would just be going. And you never use the same password that was used before. That would be bad news too. So you have to keep track of which door people have gone in. And you also have to keep track of what password people have said, and never let anybody in who's used the same password either one of the previous 2 times. It's really hard to do. It really kind of makes your brain hurt. Supertaskers can do it. And there's about 1 to 2% of people who are able to do this, but 98% of us can't. And there's something interesting about their brains and how they're organized. It's frankly fundamentally different than the way that we think. But whenever I talk about super taskers, I'm always worried. It's like undergraduates, how many people you think they're super taskers, and you get about a third of the class rate in your hand. It's like, no, it can't be. That's just not the odds. The odds are much lower. There are certainly people who are really good at it, but they're kind of few and far between. Now I want to take an example of looking at distraction and interruptions and multitasking, kind of an activity that I do quite a bit of researching, which is driving distraction, talking on a cell phone or texting. And this is an example of this where you're totally obsessed with multitasking in the sense of the pure sense of cognitive distraction. So here's a video of an intersection, and you can see that the lights are red. Person's driving along, they're talking on their cell phone. It's a hands-free cell phone. They are not dialing. Their hands are on the wheels. Their eyes are on the road. And he reports, I see the lights as green. They're not green. But it has an effect on what he sees. So he's driving along. You can see the lights are actually red for quite some time. And he just blows right through the intersection. It causes a very serious accident. That kind of accident plays out on a regular basis. Probably you're seeing accidents on the order of probably things like this several times a day. I get calls from attorneys like once a week for accidents that are just like that. The light was red, they never hit the brakes, they just blasted right through it. This is interesting because their eyes were on the road, their hands were on the wheel. It's totally the fact that they're attending to one thing and not attending to the other. This is serial processing of, I'm in this one state where I'm paying attention to the conversation and I really don't see anything that I'm looking right at, and vice versa. There's other ways to demonstrate that. I can demonstrate that here. So this is an activity that was developed by Dan Simons at Harvard. And so what you have is you have two teams bouncing basketball back and forth, a team wearing white shirts and a team wearing black shirts. And what I'd like you to do is just keep track of as the team wearing white shirts passes basketball, count the number of times they make it pass. Okay? Right? So here we go. What do you guys get for count? 14. Most people come up with 14. It's oddly enough that there's some ambiguity. It's one of the more famous video clips, 23-second video clips in psychology. How many people notice something unusual? The gorilla. A few people notice the gorilla. A few people are going, I don't know what you're talking about. So let me play it again. As you're busy counting, you're focusing attention on one activity and not the other. And so all kinds of other things happen in this video that you didn't notice in the video. Walking in the room, turning around, beating his chest, and getting it. It's always nice to have a few people who notice it, they can say, yeah, that really was in the video beginning. That's that idea. Your attention is working, so you're switching from one thing to another. Things that are as blatant as a gorilla, you just don't see if you're not paying attention. That same kind of thing, that switching cost, is the same kind of thing that happens in the complex activity like driving. When you're talking or texting and you're engaged in that activity, you're not paying attention to the road, and you miss things like traffic. When we've studied that in terms of things like talking on a cell phone, we found something we refer to as SPIDA, which is talking on a cell phone interfere with the ability to scan the driving environment, the ability to predict hazards, for example. Yeah.
So for the competitive people, how many times did they actually cross the ball?
14.
Oh, it was 14.
But did you see the gorilla?
No.
Yeah, you didn't see the gorilla, but you got it right now. That's good monotest.
Are you sure or pretty confident it was 15?
I do.
It's days. Okay, so when you talk on a cell phone, or when you text, but in particular, you're just talking on a cell phone, the conversation takes attention away from driving. So what we find is you don't scan the driving environment, you just stare straight ahead. You don't predict for hazards, so when you get to like a crosswalk, you don't look for pedestrians. You don't identify what you look at, that's an intentional blindness where you don't actually see the gorilla. You make poor decisions about maybe, say, changing lanes and how far we should be, whether you should go through a red light. And you're executing a response. So together, it's scan, predict, identify, decide, and execute a response. All these things are kind of important, and as soon as you start to try and multitask behind the wheel, you start to do this less well. And that ends up impairing your ability to be aware of the driving environment and increases the likelihood of being a crash. And it's the brain, it's not the hand. There's no difference in handheld and hands-free cell phones. The impairment's exactly the same. It doesn't matter if it's Bluetooth, doesn't matter if you're talking through your car, doesn't matter if you get whether or not it's handheld or hands-free. It's the fact that the brain is multitasking that's the problem. And when you're doing this, you get these switch costs. And when you're engaged in conversation, you're not seeing things that are right in front of you. So despite the fact that 14 states in the U.S. outlaw handheld cell phones and allow hands-free cell phones, and Utah we can do both, there's actually no benefit to outlawing one versus the other. The crash risk is the same. But the crash risk is 4 times higher. The crash risk of talking on a cell phone is the equivalent of the 0.08 blood alcohol in terms of relative risk. So it's actually a substantial risk. Now, I mentioned earlier that lots of activities require attention, even things like walking and chewing gum. So, do you have a question here?
Yeah. How much of a distraction is talking to somebody else in the phone, not on the cell phone?
The answer is it depends. So, for 2 adults who are sitting in the car and both are kind of paying attention a little bit to the road, having another adult in the car is a safety, provides safety. You have another set of eyes, and they'll help spot hazards and things you might not have noticed. They'll stop talking when driving becomes difficult. So passenger conversations for 2 adults, like everyone in this room here, actually the relative risk of a crash drops below 1, which is kind of the undistracted driving by themselves. Versus if you're talking on a cell phone, it goes to 4, so you're 4 times higher. Where that doesn't work is with teenagers, because they don't stop talking. Right? They just keep yapping, and so they keep distracting. So what we actually find with teens is they're 6 times more likely to get involved in a crash when they're talking on a cell phone. And the same kind of crash risk for having 2 teens who are, just learning how to drive in the car. It's one of the reasons why the graduated driver license laws are quite effective. They stop another teen from being in the car because that other teens are both in crash. Okay, walking and talking. Should be easy to do, right?
Watch as this man so consumed by his cell phone conversation ends up getting over heels on the train tracks. Look at that again as he takes talking on his phone 1 step to
Even walking actually requires navigation, and so obviously an example is kind of not so pleasant. But there was a researcher who just did a clever study at Western Washington University where he paper-clipped dollars to a tree. And do people notice that there are dollar bills? Take paper clip to a tree. People on a cell phone don't notice it. You'd think that students would notice any kind of money anyway. So, this multitasking and thing, it works. It's an effective walking. I can guarantee walking, riding a bicycle, riding a motorcycle. We see people texting while they're riding a motorcycle, which is absolutely crazy. Talking on a cell phone. Blind plane, in fact,
a distraction. In 2008, a distracted engineer caused the collision of a commuter train with a freight train, killing 25 and injuring dozens. In 2010, a barge ran over a duck boat and killed 2 tourists when the mate was distracted by his repeated use of his cell phone and laptop. Later that same year, a pickup driver who had sent and received 11 text messages in the 11 minutes prior to crashing into a truck set off a series of collisions that killed 2 and injured 38. The temptation to make that quick call, scan a text, or check the internet is only going to grow as even more devices and technologies become available. Yet there are proven ways to eliminate.
One of the ways is to try and manage how you're multitasking. The cars you buy these days, if you looked at a brand new car, it's just cram-packed with electronics. It's got a display. Tesla has a 17-inch monitor, right? It's plugged in with Bluetooth, so you pair most of the functions in your phone will actually now work while you're driving. Apple's got apps that can actually, they're starting to embed, so you can actually, they'll control the operating system of your car. So there's lots of ways in which we're concerned in terms of distractions on the road that it's going to become more and more fast. So let's look, now we've talked about the fact that you're slowed down. We've talked a little bit about how you have these certain kinds of areas where you don't notice things. We can start to look at the anatomy of an interruption. When you're interrupted, so let's say you have a series of operations you're trying to solve, whether it's the process information through some spreadsheet or maybe even just bake cake, a simple example. But you have a series of steps, similar to what you do in the normal workplace. You're trying to work through things. In the process of doing that multi-step operation, there's some kind of interruption. Let's just say the phone rings. That phone rings. Now you're going to stop and to deal with that device. Just kind of break up the sequence. What are the things you could do? You just say, forget about that ringing phone. I'm just going to keep working, and I'm not going to worry about it at all. So you might have a little bit of a distraction from the fact that the phone's ringing, but you just decided to ignore it. In which case, you're going to kind of just go through the series of steps, probably with very little cost. But you could also have situations in which you try and feel the two things at the same time. You're actually now trying to fill out that spreadsheet while you're talking on the cell phone. Well, probably the conversation's not going to go so well, and you may actually start to make some errors in typing. You can also have situations where, in the process of going through steps 1, 2, and 3, you get this interruption, and you just abandon this regular task, and now focus on this interrupted task. There's lots of examples of how this works. Here's one of them. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was on approach to Miami Airport. They put the landing gear down, the light didn't illuminate, turned out the bulb was burned out. The pilot got totally consumed with dealing with the light and whether the landing gear was up or down. They completely ignored the fact that they put the plane on autopilot, but it got bumped out of autopilot and just slowly made a descent. Eventually crashed and killed 101 people. They got so preoccupied with that distraction that they never came back to the primary task of flying the plane. So in situations like that, you can have catastrophic failures. You can also have situations in which there's a little bit of a delay. So instead of interruption, you basically come back and then it just takes a little bit of time to get back to the task. That may not have, that's the time delay that we talked about before, and kind of switching from one to the other. You can also have situations where you miss a step. You're going to step 1, 2, 3, there's an interruption, and you forget to do step off. And that can be a problem. We've seen, for example, in the ICU, that when people are programming an infusion pump to actually deliver drugs, that is pretty common in the ICU to get interrupted all the time by alarms and physicians and so forth. It's not that uncommon for the nurse when they come back to have forgotten a step in sequencing and programming the infusion pump. So it's delivering the wrong drug at the wrong concentration. Or in the case of baking a cake, you forget some ingredient and you end up making a mess. You can also have situations in which you get some kind of partial repeat. So you're going through the steps and you go back and you've already done step 3 and now you go back and do step 3 again. Depends on what that is, but if you're like baking a cake and step 3 was adding salt, then maybe now add twice the salt and it doesn't taste so good. You can also have situations where step 3 is a process and you do it again and you double down on something like this. That may actually have consequences that create all kinds of errors. And you can have situations where you're so distracted that you come back and go, I don't know where I was, and you have to dump the whole thing out and start all over again because you completely lost your train of thought. And lastly, you can basically say, you know what, I'm not going to let this, I'm going to wait and not be interrupted by this task until I get to the very end of this sequence. And then I'm going to come back and deal with the text message or the email or the phone call. I'm not going to let the interrupting task interfere with performance. So here's our sequence of ways in which an interruption and multitasking can lead to increasing errors. You can try and do a task, but if that doesn't work, you can completely drop one task, you can be slow, you can miss steps, you can repeat steps, you have to start all over. Those are the kinds of things that are the other kind of hidden side to multitasking where you start to have problems. We're starting to see this in the workplace. So here's a little video clip that UPS generated to talk about distractions.
A human's ability to do several things at once, it's a wonder of biology. It means we can eat a burrito while we walk down the street, and listen to music, and daydream about the weekend, all at the same time. But some kinds of multitasking cost us more time than we save. Doing two things at once, like singing while you're taking a shower, is not the same as instant messaging while you're writing a research report. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're actually having a conversation while you write. You're switching your attention back and forth between two tasks quickly. You're juggling. And when you juggle tasks, your work suffers and it takes longer because switching tasks takes time. When your brain switches from one task to another, it takes up a whole new train of thought and you lose any momentum you had on the first task, which costs on the next switch. In an office or on the internet where distractions abound, switching tasks so often can cost hours. A recent study showed that employees who are interrupted while working on a task take up to 25 minutes to get back to the thing that they started. We've got work that requires your full attention, like researching, writing, or number crunching. Stop juggling and start seeing it. For example, you've got emails coming in, but you've got to get together your slides for the presentation. Shut down your email content, finish the slides first, then attend to the email. You'll get the job done a lot faster than the juggler who switches between the slides and the email. You already know that certain kinds of multitasking is hazardous to your health, texting while driving, or drying your hair while you're in the bath. When you're splitting your attention between two tasks, remember the difference between multitasking and juggling. When you have the choice, stop juggling and get your work done faster, one at a time.
Okay, so hopefully you've at least begun to wonder whether multitasking is a good or bad thing, and maybe you've actually been convinced that there are costs associated with it, that are hidden costs in terms of time, in terms of increased errors and so forth. So how do you solve it? And, well, there are some suggestions that you can try. One of which is, this comes from Cliff Nass, he calls it the 20-minute rule, and he says, look, try and set up your schedule so you get chunks of time that are uninterrupted. Turn off your email client so it doesn't deliver mail during those chunks of time. Shut your door, put it do not disturb. You can set it up so your phone doesn't ring. Basically get these 20-minute blocks so that you can process whatever you're doing without distraction. Don't become a slave to email. The default setting on these email clients is that when a mail message is delivered, it can make this little ding, and so you got to check it to see what it is. But it's easy to go back in there and change it so it delivers the mail every 30 minutes, every hour, so that instead of being a slave to when the messages come in, you can choose when you want to get it. Notice that 23% of the day is associated with struggling through email. Most of which are garbage, right? Most of which are like just deleted, or you can ignore. You can use voicemail. So if you're in the process of one of these 20-minute chunks, let the voicemail take the answer, and then you can call back if it's an important message. So some other examples: create a no interruption zone. Set up do not disturb. Educate the staff. So if you're just trying to do this by yourself and nobody else in the room, nobody else in the office is going to participate, well, you're going to be basically just fighting an uphill battle. Forget about it. But if you all get on message and say, you know what, we're going to try and actually not interrupt ourselves constantly, you can kind of work these things. We identify useful times that you can actually be interrupted, develop checklists to work through things properly, manage those mobile devices so that you don't become a slave to them. In particular, what we know is alarms, alerts, and so forth are designed, they can create a branding response, and triggers this fight or flight mechanism. And so if you control some of those activities, you're more likely to actually be in charge of your life. There's a technique called the Pomodoro technique. You may have heard of it. Basically what you do is you take for every half hour, you break that half hour into 25 minutes of uninterrupted time. And you have a little clock and you basically set it for 25 minutes. And you don't do anything but work on that activity for 25 minutes. When the bell rings, you get up and you do anything but that for 5 minutes. You'll answer emails, or get a drink, or talk to colleagues, make a call. When that alarm has gone off for 5 minutes, you got to kind of use the timer. You go back and you work for another 25 minutes. So you still are working for big uninterrupted chunks of time, but you still have time when you're able to field emails, phone calls, and stuff like this. And after the fourth one of these, you basically take 15 minutes. So here's a chunk of time, and we've broken it into manageable, uninterrupted chunks of time, but then you manage and control how the interruptions structure go. Maybe this is unworkable in your daily environment, but it's worth at least thinking about ways in which you could actually sort out some of the distractions that are causing you to multitask, and don't do it so that you're a slave to technology. Because if you're a slave to technology, you're like this guy here. You don't replace it. Because having to juggle several things at once, it's just stressful, isn't it? And so these are the things you're trying to juggle, each one of them is kind of saying, this one if that's what your daily life is like, it's no good. And so try to figure out ways to basically streamline it so you're not quite so. Let this guy get an plate. I think it's a useful metaphor for interruptions in the office. These problems aren't new. I mean, 1740, steady, undissipated attention to one object is a sure mark of superior genius, as hurry, bustle, and agitation are never telling symptoms of a weak and troublous mind. But you can there's actually quite a few books on this. There's two that are actually kind of useful. One is by Manny Jackson, Distracted, the Erosion of Attention and Becoming Archaic. And another book by Dave Crenshaw called The Myth of Multitasking. There are several others besides this. These books are useful because they start to talk about the myth and try and deconstruct this myth that you're more efficient when you're multitasking, and they provide some suggestions on how to get better. So, with that, I'm happy to answer